Hello and welcome to Reaching for the Moon, presented by Everglades Moon Local Council, Florida chapter of Covenant of the Goddess. COG supports individual works by its covens, members, and local councils. It's a vibrant network of a myriad of Wiccan and witchy resources, religious support, friendships, service opportunities, and more. To find out more, visit our website, emlc.net, our Facebook page, facebook.com/EvergladesMoon, or Twitter, @EMLCTweets.
This is Lady Bridget. Hello and welcome to episode 32 for Beltane 2017. We've got a great show for you today, starting with Lord Riekin and his segment, It'll Grow on You, with Burn Baby Burn, Making Beltane Fire. Pandie's Pagan Projects brings us How to Make Shower Melts. And if you don't know what a shower melt is, you'll just have to stay tuned and listen. And then Qabal has his segment, FooDoo, and he's going to teach us all about artisanal waters, what they are, and how to make them. Lastly, we have an interview with Canu, one of our Everglades Moon Local Council members who recently started his first foray into beekeeping. He has a lot of great insights and good information, and we hope you will enjoy that segment. And of course, we have music and songs, and I'll introduce those as they occur. Happy Beltane, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the show.
All right, hello everyone, Lord Riekin here. So I've been requested since Beltane's coming up to do a segment on fire making. So everybody likes to have a fire for Beltane. So, the basic ingredients for a fire. You need oxygen, fuel, and a spark. Oxygen is in the air around us. The spark to ignite is a match or a lighter or whatever, and that brings us to fuel. The beginning of a fire consists of tinder, kindling, and then the fuel logs themselves. Lighter fluid, in whatever form you choose to use it, is the equivalent of tinder.
When you say tinder, what exactly do you mean?
Wood is wood. The difference between tinder, kindling, and fuel wood is the ratio between the surface area and the overall volume of a piece. So tinder has a lot of surface area and a very small volume. In other words, pine needles, leaves, lots of surface area, very little volume.
Dryer lint stuffed into a toilet paper roll has always been one of my favorites.
As long as you don't stuff it too tightly, yes. Anything that has a pretty good sized surface area. If you take a sharp broken piece of glass and scrape it along a stick, you can make long curls. Those are wonderful tinder in and of themselves. Pine needles are great tinder. Piles of loose leaves are good tinder. Lighter fluid is a good tinder. Or my favorite tinder in the terms of the liquid fuels is just to use lamp oil, tiki torch oil, because things like lighter fluid, gasoline, kerosene, there's a little bit too much woof factor on them.
So when you say woof factor, you mean you lean over to light it and you lose your eyebrows.
Yeah, your arm hair and everything else. You want something that is readily flammable but does not gas off really quick, because when you light the match and you start to put it that way, you find out that a foot or so away from the liquid that you can see is the combustible vapors that are ready to go. So, you throw the match on it if you have to use one of those things. I much prefer to use, just as I say, tiki torch fuel. It's inexpensive, it saturates well, it doesn't evaporate really quickly, it gives you some time to work with it when you light it, unless you've thrown way too much of it on and you're trying to put it down into a hollowed area or something. There's usually no big problem with gaseous vapors flaming off on you so that you lose either the hair on your hands and arms or your eyebrows or whatever. But to get back again to the basic premise here, it's all a matter of surface ratio to mass. I literally know people who thought that they could take logs 4 inches in diameter and liberally dose them with lighter fluid and start a fire. You can't do that. It's simply doesn't work unless you have an endless pool underneath so that you can roast the logs for a long time before they catch fire, and that doesn't work. You want your tinder, that is your very small, light, flammable stuff. Lots of little sticks, old bird's nest.
Sable palm leaves, things you can find.
Dried leaves, dear. Sable palms are just fine, too.
Okay. Dried grasses, anything like that?
Dried grass, anything that is high surface area to low volume and is dry makes good tinder. That's what you put the match on. And the match lights that. You have lit your tinder. The tinder ignites the kindling. The kindling catches actual real fire that can be sustained. You can build a fire all night long with kindling if it's all the size material that you had, but you'd be feeding it constantly because the stuff would burn up too quickly. But then the kindling catches the larger material on fire, and then you have a sustainable fire that you only have to feed from time to time.
What would your definition of kindling be?
Kindling starts at about the size of your index finger in terms of diameter. And kindling is anything from about the size of the digits on your hand up to about an inch. Up to about, a little bit bigger around than a broom handle.
Okay, good definition.
Okay. And
if a witch doesn't know what the size of a broom handle, they should give back their witch card.
There you go. Then the stuff bigger than that, you have your smaller fuel logs and your larger fuel logs and your larger fuel logs. Just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You just start with the smallest and it works up from there. But, you have to remember the progression. You start with the smallest, that catches the next biggest, that catches the next biggest, and before you know it, you have a bonfire. So the next step is, how do you build the fire once you've managed to light a fire? So the way you build a fire, well, there's many different patterns building a fire. You can find them online. The one I like to use is the trench fire, which means that what I do is I dig a trench about a foot wide by 6 to 9 inches deep below the surface of the ground level where you're building the fire. And that will usually be about 2 feet wide. If you're building a bigger bonfire than that to start off, then 3 feet wide or 4 feet wide or however much it needs to be, because it needs to be as large as the initial stack of wood that you're piling on there. In the middle of that trench is where you put your tinder. You're going to go to your smallest fuel wood on top of that kindling, and you're going to build a loose square, like doing Lincoln logs. Opposite, 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 opposite. Build yourself a square. Then you throw your kindling wood on top of your tinder in that loose square you just made. You can't put
the inside?
Inside of the loose square, yes.
Okay.
And you can pile in more tinder along with that kindling built inside that square. And then on the outside of that square, you can start building a teepee of wood that leans up against that square. And then you can build a somewhat larger teepee on top of that. Beyond that, that's about where you'll want to stop, unless you're going to have grand plans for some gigantic bonfire, which you can, if you want, just keep building out from there. You just need to have that initial construction done. You've probably noticed when we're down in Miami that I have lots of logs stacked around the perimeter of that fire pit, because the wood down there is always waterlogged. So I always start stacking my next run of wood outside so that it has a chance to heat and bake as the fire burns for a couple of hours, so that it's already kind of preheated when we get ready to throw it in the middle. Oh, also, of course, newspaper. Tinder is newspaper, and tinder soaked with a little bit of lamp oil is really the way to go. You can't go wrong with that. You can't fail to make a good fire. If part of your tinder is crumpled up newspaper with a dash of oil on it, good way to go. Then you need to run some of your tinder out to the edge of that fire so that you can light at the edge of the fire instead of shoving your arm down in the middle of all that stuff and worrying about either knocking it over, falling into it, or anything else, so that your fire can then run back into the middle, start up through the middle of that Lincoln log stack that you made, ignites the kindling, and the kindling ignites the smaller fuel wood that you built the Lincoln logs out of, and then that starts lighting up the first teepee outside of that, and you just take it from there.
So, since oxygen is needed for a fire, as you mentioned earlier, it's important to leave space between your Lincoln log structure. That's why you do
You can't do it.
opposite.
You can't help but make a space because you're doing the opposite and opposite. So it leaves as much opening in between. And you don't pack down your tinder, of course. Your tinder is left on the lighter and fluffier side as well.
So it could get air.
Yeah, so like I said, not all leaves make good tinder. Live oak leaves don't make good tinder because when you try to stack them, they flatten on top of each other so much. Now, if you mix live oak leaves along with other stuff, that's fine. But, if you try to use straight up live oak leaves, you'll usually find that they don't make very good tinder.
And they smother.
Yeah, they smother themselves. As on the other hand, pine needles, well, you can pack them as much as you want because that's just kind of like a miniature version of your Lincoln log tower. Pine needles are like, plain pickup sticks. No matter how you throw them, there's going to be lots of air in between them.
So what if somebody doesn't have the ability to dig a trench? What if they're just doing this in like a fire pit or an off-the-ground kind of container?
Well, that's self-regulating then.
But I mean, it's the same principle, right?
If you're building it off the ground in a fire pit, then the fire pit has oxygen openings at the bottom, which serve the same purpose.
But I mean, you would still use the same setup
Same
with the tinder in the middle
yes.
and the kindling
Right.
on
the
top
same
of
techniques.
it, and then the fuel logs in a Lincoln log.
Right. You can build these
around
fires
it.
without using that trench that I was talking about. The reason I like to use the trench is because it gives a good draft of air to the center. And you need to have, airflow into the pile so it'll catch and burn properly. If you're using a well, just call it a fire cauldron. If you're using a cauldron, just do the best you can. I don't like building a fire in an actual cauldron without having holes drilled in the bottom of it, obviously, for the reason that you tend to have a restricted airflow, in which case be very certain that you're keeping lots and lots of openings and such in there. You're not going to go building a bonfire in a cauldron, but, you can get a pretty good blaze going.
In a container.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So fire safety.
Fire safety, always rake combustibles back a good ways from the fire that you're making. I mean, if you're making a campfire, then they just say 30 inches or so. But if you're making a Beltane fire, if you're going to dance around it, then rake everything back for 20 feet or so. Sparks from popping wood, depending upon what types of wood you're using, the sparks pop and fly 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 feet sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to make sure that those little tiny coals that go flying out there don't have anything that they can ignite. I can't go through the different characteristics of all the different woods you might be using. Just be aware that pine wood is going to pop a lot more than hardwoods. One of the woods that you often can buy at the grocery store is the white birch. The white birch does a lot of popping too.
Mm-hmm.
Better off buying the mixed hickory oak at Home Depot than you are buying the white birch. Love the smell of the white birch, love the way it burns in so many other ways, but it pops and snaps just about as badly as pine does. So, if you're going to be using it, do be sure that you have proper fire safety and that you spread it well out and well away.
Do they need water on hand?
I always like to have, actually what I like to have is a hose coiled up just outside the circle, but like down at in Miami, we don't have that capability, so I always have at least a couple of 5-gallon buckets full of water on the perimeter. And they're not just good for, an emergency. Well, they are good for an emergency, but different kind of emergency. If somebody does burn themselves, step 1, put the offended piece in the water, cool it as quickly as possible. Don't worry about infection if the water isn't the cleanest. Sometimes we get the water out of the river there. More important to cool the flesh. You take care of the antibiotics later if you have to.
Mm-hmm.
But, just in case somebody gets burned, steps on a hot coal and bare feet, put the foot in the water. Then after it's soothed a little bit, then you can start addressing it with some aloe or whatever.
Or ice. Ice is perfect for that.
Yes, but usually the ice isn't necessarily on hand. But get it in the water first and then put the ice on if you can get ice to it. But, get it in that water first. That way, at least the flesh is wet when you put the ice on it, and that helps too.
Mm-hmm.
So make sure that make sure that somebody responsible and paying attention knows where the water buckets are, and make sure the water buckets are there.
In regards to wood, you started to talk about different kinds of wood. I've been told that you shouldn't use like recycled wood that's been painted because the paint fumes are toxic. Is there any truth to that?
Well, yes, there is truth to that. I wouldn't be too concerned about most latex paints, if you can be certain that what you're going to burn is latex. Most varnishes are safe, but the polyurethane varnishes are not. That was much more true 50 years ago, when most of the old wood you'd find was painted with a lead-based paint. Not only were those paints lead-based, but they were also oil-based.
So if you're burning something that's been recently recycled, it's not as big an issue?
Not nearly as big an issue, no.
Okay.
Older stuff, that was made with oil-based paint, that used paint coloring that had lead in it, way, way more dangerous than a little bit of latex paint.
So unless you're using recycled wood from a house that's over 50 years old, you're probably okay.
Probably.
Just don't breathe it in.
I can still buy oil-based paint and use it, so use a little common sense, and if in doubt, don't. As well as the fact that, you certainly don't want to use it in the early stages, because any painted surface is harder to ignite than an unpainted surface. So it would be for throwing on much later on once the fire was going good.
Well, that makes sense.
Okay, so, what do you do around the after party?
When everybody wants to go to bed now and you have this blazing fire.
Yeah, when everybody wants to go to bed and you have a blazing fire, then guess what? Somebody ain't going to bed. Because somebody needs to be there to watch the fire. To speed up the process, we need the fire tools. If you're building a bonfire, you need to have access to a shovel, preferably a flat shovel. You need to have a hard-tined rake. In other words, the rake with like 3-inch long prongs on it, not a grass rake, a dirt rake, what we call a hard rake. Those are absolutely the 2 minimum tools you need, because with those tools you can push your fire around, you can grab things and fish them around in it, and they're also what you need to put the fire to bed for the night. So let's say the last of the revelers has left, you've got a fire that's still burning, but it's burned down some, and you're the fire tender. So first step usually is to grab that hard-tined rake, shove the branches around so that you kind of distribute everything. Lay it all down as flat to the ground as you can get it so that there's no air coming up underneath it to keep it lit, as it were. Most of the time, a fire like that will go out within a few minutes. You'll stop having flames. You start stirring that around, you get a little bit of flame for a few minutes here, a few minutes there, but not too much. So you've knocked the fire down, you've pulled it apart so that all the pieces aren't touching. You've got a beautiful bed of coals. Usually a few people are going to want to come around and do a little bit of reading in the coals. That's fine, because you can't speed this part of the process up too much. Depending upon how big your fire was, if you have a bed of coals 3, 4, 5 inches deep, well, unless you're going to start throwing water on it, you're probably going to be babysitting it for a good while. If your fire was small enough so that when you rake it all out, your bed of coals is less than an inch, or you can see little bits of dirt between your coals, you can burn that out in pretty short order. It'll go out on its own, and you can stir it around and stir the dirt and the coals together, and they'll dissipate on their own. Probably won't need to throw any water on it. On the other side of that coin, if you wanted to bank a fire, then you knock it down like I said before, and then you rake it all up into a pile in the middle, and then you take your flat shovel and you start scooping dirt from around the sides, and you throw it on top of it to reduce the airflow to it, and you'll still have coals in the morning if you're going to light it back up to make another fire.
So it's safe to put dirt over it and bank it like a little puddle, like a little pile?
Yeah. Now, safe, well, that's a relative term. If somebody goes wandering through it in the middle of the night, then they're going to be in great distress.
So if you're going to bank a fire, then you probably want to make sure you have a ring of stones around it to mark it so people don't do that.
Yeah. That would be a very good idea. But if you want to put the fire out quickly right then and there, again, you knock it down, you stir it around, you start throwing some water on it judiciously, and then stirring it, throwing a little more water and stirring it, throwing a little more water and stirring it, unless you have a hose handy, in which case you can just soak the heck out of it. But assuming that you've got to scoop these buckets of water and trundle them 100 feet or something, then, try to be efficient in your use of water. Make some mud in the middle of the fire area, and then use the rake to stir the coals back and forth through the mud, so that you don't have to go making as many trips with the water. Oftentimes when you have a good fire pit, it's just good to break it down, spread it out, and let it just burn itself out so that it's just ash in the morning, because ash is a lot easier to clean up the next day than chunks of charcoal are. And let it just burn itself out. Of course, hopefully nobody's going to come along after you've gone to bed and it's like, oh, I want to play in the fire some, and they throw some more kindling on it, it gets going, then they get bored and they walk off, and you've got a fire going again in the middle of this whole thing, which has happened, unfortunately, to me on several occasions.
It can happen.
It's usually best just to figure you're going to stay up all night watching the darn thing.
If you're the fire tender.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's small.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Lord Riekin. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, just be safe when you're playing around a fire, but being able to build a fire is a skill that everyone, pagan and not, should know how to do, and you should try getting some practice at it. It's fun. Playing with fire is fun. Release the inner kid. Let them play.
You're a pyro.
Yes, I am a pyro.
Well, you are the preferred fire tender for every pagan gathering that you've attended.
Yeah, that's pretty much true.
Which is why I thank you very much for imparting your knowledge of fire lore and fire tending.
Since this will be the Beltane podcast, happy Beltane, everyone.
Can you meet me here at Beltane? Can you come when you hear the call? I need to be with my family, coming home to one and all. I can't wait to get away. I can't wait to be among people like all my family in a place that feels like home. Can you meet me here at Beltane? Can you come when you hear the call? I need to be with my family, coming home to one and all. Just when life is driving me crazy and I'm tired of mundane rules, give me fun and fantasy in the hot tub and the pool. Can you meet me here at Beltane? Can you come when you hear the call? I need to be with my family, coming home to one and all. When I'm through with wearing uniforms, want to be where I have my choice. It's so good to see your shining face and to hear your loving voice. Can you meet me here at Beltane? Can you come when you hear the call? I need to be with my family, coming home to one and all. Now perhaps you'll understand why we come back again and again, how you can be drawn to a place at a certain time and space. Can you meet me here at Beltane? Can you come when you hear the call? I need to be with my family, coming home to one and all. I need to be with my family, coming home to one and all.
That was one of my songs, Meet Me at Beltane, from my album Voices of the Goddess by Lady Bridget and the Belladonnas.
Hey everyone, this is Pandie, and it's time for another one of Pandie's Pagan Projects. If you're like me, you're always looking for new ways to use essential oils for things like stress relief or invigoration, or even to help you prepare for ritual. A typical use of oils that are safe to put on your skin is to add them to your bath water. But if you're also like me, you prefer showers to baths, or you might not even have a bathtub. So how's a witch supposed to soak up all the good juju of the oils if she can't take a dip in them? That's where this episode's craft comes in. We're going to make shower melts. To make this project, you will need 1 cup of cornstarch, 2 tablespoons of water, plus more to make a dough, an essential oil of your choice. For this go-around, as it's spring, we're going to use lavender. And you'll also need an ice cube tray. Now, you can use any size ice cube tray depending on how big you want your melts to be. A mini one might work best, as well as one of those awesome latexy, spongy ones that you can pop things out of really easily. You can also use food coloring, but remember to test the color first. You don't want to make beautiful shower melts that then cause you to have to be on your hands and knees scrubbing your tub or tile. To start, place the cornstarch and your essential oil in a bowl. I suggest starting with about 5 drops and then see how it smells. Remember that you can always add more. If it ends up being too overpowerful, you could always double the recipe. Mix this well and you'll end up with a mixture that's got a crumbly powder sort of texture. If you're going to add food coloring, I would add that next. For lavender, you might want to go with a pretty purple or swirl some blue and red together, which also makes purple, but will also make pretty swirls. Give this a mix to incorporate the color into the cornstarch. Now we'll start to add our water. We'll begin with those first 2 tablespoons. This allows the oil and the colors to disperse into the cornstarch. You'll get more clumps this way. Continue adding the water a few drops at a time, making sure to mix it well each time before incorporating any more water. You're looking to end up with a thick paste. Once you have that nice paste, spoon it out into your ice cube trays. If they're the regular plastic ones like I use, you might want to give them a little spray with some cooking spray or a dusting of cornstarch to make the melts pop out easier later on. Put them in the freezer and freeze them until the mixture is set. This can take about an hour or so. It'll depend in part on how much water you ended up using. As long as you didn't use a ton of water, once they're set, you might not even need to keep them in the freezer to store them. You might just be able to store them in a cool, dry place in a tightly sealed jar or canister. But if they get a little runny at room temperature, you may need to keep them in a freezer in a zipper bag instead. To use them, just place the melt on the floor of the shower and turn on the hot water. As the water and steam hits the melt, it'll break down and diffuse the oil into the air. And that's it. I can't wait to see what colors and smells you guys use to make your melts. Feel free to post on our podcast page or visit us on Facebook and let us know what recipes you used for your melts. Blessed be!
Hi, this is Qabal, and welcome to FooDoo. So the other day, we were in a restaurant in Fort Lauderdale that I won't name, but it is very famous for baked dairy-based desserts, and it's near a street that's Spanish for the waves. And they brought me, so I could taste, an artisanal water. Now, let me repeat that. It's artisanal water. So I guess I had missed this craze of I can barely say it, artisanal water. Because in my world, artisanal is applied to a food, usually meaning that it's well crafted and gourmet, typically made by someone who worked hard and a long time to get the product right. It implies, of course, a level of skill that's superior to the product of that, and it's close to a delicacy. You might use it to describe a craft beer or a cheese, but probably not a bag of cheesy poofs or water. Primarily because most of us don't actually make water, because that requires a stellar nursery. So anyway, this artisanal water, what it involved was these bottom-dwelling blueberries that were slightly tinting a carafe of cold tap water, in which chunks of avocado floated very conspicuously at the top while they slowly broke down into a greenish oil slick that accumulated on the edge of this plastic container. It was very not appetizing, and I was invited to enjoy it, so I didn't. Because when I also tasted it, because they wanted me to, it tasted like tap water that had been slightly colored blue, and it was oily. So that doesn't sound artisanal. But it did get me thinking that summer is coming, and we like cold drinks. And at the same time, this involves a witch solution to that drink abomination. That artisanal water is technically, and in culinary terms, an infusion, also in witchy terms. And an infusion is a potion, and nothing says witch like potion. Well, except witch. Anyway, so infused water, it became apparently popular a few years ago. The Italians have been doing it for a couple of millennia, but that's okay. Anyway, I thought we should review how to make some of these ingested potions, especially the 101 from the herbalist side. So we generally make 4 things for consumption that parallel food preparations, and they are brews, decoctions, infusions, and tinctures. And we might also include their syrups and teas. Occasionally we hear the term tonic, but that's a term that's more about a process and about how it makes you feel rather than the process itself. And I included those syrups and teas in addition to those 4 things because they're also in there, and we use the terms as part of the others. So let's start with brews. Brews involve some kind of fermentation, usually preceded by some kind of extraction process with the plant material. So think beer, where the process involves a combination of malting the grains, mashing the hops, boiling, and then ultimately fermenting. Decoctions are different. They are the predecessors to brews, but a decoction is in fact a method as well as a product. It involves extracting volatile oils and other substances from plant materials using boiling water. The process involves simmering as well as steeping, but it can also involve things like percolation as well as centrifuging. The process is also applied to meats and vegetables in the preparations of bouillons and stocks. Coffee is generally a decoction, but it's not exclusively one. Basically, plant material that's hard or woody requires a decoction. Infusions, this is our bad boy. Infusions are the result of using a solvent, typically water, but can be alcohol or oil, to extract flavor compounds from plant materials. Infusions might use heat, but often it's more about the plant material's flavor solubility as well as time. Infusions generally take time, and infusions can be made with cold water as long as the plant material is carefully selected. It's generally fruit or some of the leaves from herbs, and they work fine. Bark doesn't work so well. It would require much more time. Cold brewed coffee, which is of course the coffee bean, using a process like a French press, is in fact an infusion. And generally, plant materials that are soft are the easiest to use in infusion. So syrups are best considered a condiment. They're actually the result of a decoction. Generally, syrups are the combination of water and sugar into that viscous liquid that's highly saturated. Syrups can be made by heating as well as reduction, as in the case of maple syrup or a simple syrup, but it can also be made from an enzymatic reaction, which is the case in actually corn syrup. Of course, syrups have an intensified flavor and are usually highly sweet. So again, syrups are the result of a process rather than the process itself. Teas are also the same thing in the sense that they are the result of a process rather than the process itself. Teas are the result of either a decoction or an infusion. If a woody substance is used in the making of the tea, then it would follow a decoction pattern. If it was something like a tea leaf that just required some warm water, then it would be an infusion. And finally, there's a tincture. Now, tinctures are chemical extractions involving alcohol and specifically ethanol to extract the flavor compounds of plant materials. And the key mechanism here is actually time so that the volatile oils have an opportunity to dissipate inside of the alcohol. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind in choosing an extraction process. First of all, the harder the plant material, the better it is to choose decoction. The downside of decoction is that it can actually destroy some of the subtle flavors, and it can actually build up bitter flavors or off notes in foods. Infusions, while they're good for leaves and fruits, require more care for contamination control, especially if there's not a significant amount of heat used in the process. The advantage of tinctures is also the disadvantage, and that is alcohol. Alcohol can destroy volatile oils and actually over-extract unwanted flavors, not to mention that some individuals avoid alcohol generally. So back to the infusion horror from earlier and how to avoid it. Cold infusions are not only popular, they're actually really, really great summer drinks. They are incredibly easy to make, they're low in calories, and all you have to do is follow a few simple rules. So I'm going to go down the simple rules. First, rule number 1 is inspect every ingredient. All ingredients should be at peak of flavor, and each ingredient should be respected. Nothing should go in if it's past its prime. The second thing, wash every ingredient first. This is particularly true for thin-skinned fruit. They can carry not only off flavors, but they can also carry unwanted things like pesticides. The third thing, fruits must be cut. Those whole blueberries in the drink abomination from earlier will only release their flavor when they rot in the water. So crush or cut all fruit. The skin of the fruit has evolved to keep the fruit part in and everything else out, including the water you put it in. So it has to be cut or removed for it to be able to ultimately flavor the water that it's in. The fourth thing, the harder the fruit, the thinner the slice. Strawberries can go in chunks, cucumbers need about 1/4 inch in slices, and pears require super thin slices. Fifth, avoid oily fruits like avocados, as well as nuts. They just won't mix in the water and they won't add anything to the flavors. 6. Go light on the citrus, unless you're making lemonade. The reason is actually that the flavor from a citrus in a drink will only be okay in sort of low amounts. Citrus in drinks after a few hours will release a very bitter flavor. So and you probably have noticed that most citrus have a white layer, and that white layer is very, very bitter. And the longer it sits in the water, the more bitter it will flavor the water. So citrus doesn't really do well in long soaks. I would suggest 3 hours max. The seventh thing, go light on leaves unless you really like the flavor. But remember, the thicker the leaf, the longer the time. Basil, mint, and cilantro are good herbs for flavoring, and they require just small amounts. Rose petals, hibiscus, and fennel fronds are also great, and they're good with a little bit more time. Rosemary, of course, is thicker, and it takes time, and cinnamon and cloves will require the longest time because those are hard or they're woody or barks. The eighth thing is to use a glass container. Plastics can contain residues from prior uses, so they should really be avoided. And the glass container, of course, being cleaned before it's used. Ninth, give time to this process. Infusion at room temperature takes a few hours, and then it can go in the fridge before serving. And keep in mind that you want to do contamination control, so after a few hours it should really go in the fridge, and it's only going to last for a few days. The 10th thing is keep things to 3 ingredients plus the water. And it's absolutely okay to keep refilling with water. The ingredients will be good for multiple refills. But that 3 ingredient max property is a good strategy. If there are too many ingredients, then the flavors get lost. And if there's just 1 ingredient, that's actually okay. So the fewer the ingredients, the better, 3 being max. And lastly, these infusions aren't really meant to be sweetened. They're really kind of low-calorie drinks. But if you do want to sweeten it, I would suggest trying something like stevia instead of sugar. Sugar will make the drink much heavier, and it also competes for flavors as it dissolves in the water, meaning that it will take longer for the flavors to get into the water for you to enjoy. And there's another thing with sugar is that it also attracts other contaminants. It can grow things in it. So really, it's a substance to avoid, if at all possible. So that's it. Here are some combinations that I like, but of course it's all up to you. I like lemon slices and lavender sprigs. That's one combination. I also like mango, pineapple, and spearmint. And I also occasionally like strawberry and orange. And there's a 4th one that I like that I wasn't going to include, but now I am, and that's to use vanilla bean. Once that you remove the seeds from the vanilla bean, You can use the husk of the vanilla bean to flavor sugar. And then if you don't use it for flavoring sugar, you can put it in your water and it will flavor the water very nicely. And I like it with strawberries. Remember that it's a combination for you to enjoy and combine away. Have a blessed and refreshing Beltane.
I am the calm, I am the quickening. Beltane, 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 Beltane. I am the calm, I am the quickening, I'm the intoxication and the force. I am the silence, I am the singer, I'm the stallion galloping to its source. Beltane, 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 Beltane. Maiden, touch my hand, lift me up, spark my blood in a field of flowers. Green and sweep me up, lay me down, quench my thirst in a field of flowers. Maiden, touch my hand, lift me up, spark my blood in a field of flowers. Green and sweep me up, lay me down, quench my thirst in a field of flowers. Beltane, 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 Beltane. I am the bright pavilion and the feasting, I'm the wedding couple and the bed. I am the morning chorus and the heartbeat, I'm the goal to which all paths are led. Beltane, 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 Beltane.
I hope they bless the land.
Beltane, 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 Green men sweep me up.
And that song was called Song of Beltane. It's by the Crow Women, and it's from their album Crow Goddess. If you'd like to learn more about the Crow Women or buy their music, you can find them at www. Oh, what am I saying? Nobody says that anymore. You can find them at crowwomen.com. And next up, an interview with Canu.
This is Lady Bridget, and for the podcast episode Disc Rabbit, I'm interviewing Canu, who recently got into beekeeping. I thought it might be interesting because you are really a newbie, as they say. How long have you had your bees?
I would say the newbie is certainly an accurate description. We've had bees at the house now in our backyard beekeeping effort for just over a week.
So what made you decide that you wanted to keep bees?
Well, my partner Raina has been interested in beekeeping for quite a while, and it's an interest that I've been supportive of and interested in as well. We first thought about beekeeping many years ago when we moved to Miami Springs, Florida. And when I checked out the local regulations regarding beekeeping, we couldn't do it at the time. We were a bit disappointed, but I think in 2014 it was, the state passed a law that preempted local beekeeping restrictions and provided for some ability to do more suburban and urban beekeeping. So at that point, we decided that we would bone up a little bit on beekeeping and see if we could prepare to try it. That was a few years ago. And so over the last couple of years, we've slowly gotten ourselves a little bit more prepared. And more recently, since we have a couple of friends who do beekeeping in South Florida, we were offered the opportunity to try and see if we could bring home a swarm of bees that are luckily local and well acclimated to our area. We basically said yes, we'd love to be able to bring some bees home. So we were in a little bit of a waiting period and used that time to make sure that we had basic equipment available and the resources to transport bees home and to keep them here.
Cool. So let me ask you a question. What are your goals in keeping bees? Not just from, a homeowner perspective, but from a pagan perspective.
I think we've had a couple of clear shared goals. As longtime pagans, we really do want to see at what level we can help affect our local environment and ecology. So backyard beekeeping offers an opportunity for there to be bee populations locally that aren't being commercially managed and trucked around the country and exposed to a lot of extra treatment and foraging that is pretty heavily treated with pesticides and herbicides. So we really thought that backyard beekeeping would be really beneficial to our local ecology. We also perceived beekeeping as something that would be kind of a sacred endeavor in the sense of something we could do very locally that would support the type of values that we hold as pagans. Locally here, I've had a reading from my head, and I'm considered a child of Oshun, for whom bees are a sacred animal. So the ability to offer honey for Oshun that is produced in our backyard is something that I would look forward to when the hive is mature enough to be able to offer that. And we're both very Sishif apprentices, and one of the totem animals associated with that path are bees. They're associated with the star world and the kind of fundamental sacred vibration of the expression of the universe into our world. So it also provides us an opportunity to work with one of the totem animals of our spiritual development.
Really, very interesting. And of course, having honey that's locally made, and you can't get much more local than your own backyard, usually. And also being able to process maybe a little bit of beeswax, make your own ritual candles. That's going to be quite the incentive.
Yeah, some of the goals that are not too long-term do involve being able to share the resources of the hive that they may have to offer as the hive develops and matures, like honey and beeswax. So if we have the opportunity to produce candles and honey for our rituals and offerings, that's going to be a great thing to do. But even in the shorter term, the beneficial effect on our yard and our local ecology is of more immediate value. So we have fruit trees in our yard, and we have a really old grandmother sea grape that kind of towers over our backyard. The trees that we've planted in general include lime and lemon, mango, plantain, and banana. We maintain a small herb garden, and we have vegetable gardens at times too. And all of those things will benefit from having pollinators like bees readily available locally. Pretty much everybody I've talked to about having backyard beekeeping says that the health and the vitality of their trees and plants just increases noticeably.
Yeah, you'll probably get a bumper crop on your fruit trees, especially.
Our sea grape trees at this time are just starting to put out spikes and are about to flower. For us locally here, it's early April, and it's a season where sea grape flowers and then starts to fruit. So while our beehive is very new, and I expect that most of the resources from that are going to go into building the hive instead of putting in a lot of honey for us this year, there's a great opportunity for both the mango bloom that's just kind of at its peak or finishing right now, and the sea grape bloom that's starting out to be really healthy for our new hive to be able to have plenty of forage. We've been able to see the hive develop even during the last week.
Oh, cool. It's surprising how quickly that can happen.
Yeah, on Sunday I did our first weekly hive inspection, and when we brought the hive home last Saturday night, we basically brought it home in what's called a 5-frame nucleus hive. So the swarm that our friends captured was already developing new comb and brood in their own 5-frame nuke. So we transferred it to ours and brought it on home. I tried to transfer it to the new main hive pretty soon so that they would face most of the disruption that they're going to have early on and could get used to their environment and the new hive environment as quickly as possible. But that also meant that we gave them a lot of new area to build in that is basically just going to be reserved for their hive. It's not going to be something that we harvest honey from or otherwise try and move around too much or disturb as time goes on. So one of the things that we did was put a few new frames into the main hive, and after a week, the foundationless frames that we put in there are each showing probably about almost a third of their volume being built with new comb already.
Cool.
Hive is busily at work, basically making their new home being built out so that they could put in new brood or lay in pollen or honey for their own long-term success. So
I have been told that sea grape honey is really delicious.
It's distinctive, and I think it's really delicious. Some people find it a little bit spicy or strong. I've had sea grape honey from the Keys, and I'm really looking forward to seeing whether or not there's any honey that we could taste from this initial, what they call a flow, when there's a large bloom and it's collected back into the hive. Most beekeepers call that a flow. But I really understand, too, that for the time being, most of the energy that this hive is gathering needs to go into building their new home.
Right, and also then you don't have to worry about if you took too much honey and they don't have enough reserves, then some people feel like they have to feed the bees and all of that. I don't want to get too technical because I know probably a lot of our listeners are not really beekeepers and don't really understand all the ins and outs. But the other thing I wanted to ask you is if you had plans on their diseases and pests and things like that come into contact and can cause colony collapse disorder or cause other issues with the beehives. Did you plan on treating them, or do you plan on being a treatment-free? I know there's quite a debate among the bee community for each of those.
That's a really good question, and I think part of what any person who decides they want to pursue beekeeping should do is to read up a bit on that debate and to, amongst other debates as well, and to try and develop their own strategy for beekeeping and keep an open mind about what they may learn as they go. For our beekeeping, our intent is to pursue a treatment-free beekeeping strategy. So our best understanding of backyard beekeeping and the best way to succeed for the goals that we might have of having healthy pollinators and our local ecology would not mean that we try and treat the bees with antibiotics or other chemicals along the way to help keep down the pests and diseases that the hive might face. Because, like a lot of insects, bees have a relatively short-term life cycle over time, which means that they also have an opportunity to potentially adapt to the local conditions that a beehive is in. Beehives in Florida face some of the same challenges that other beehives around the country do, like small hive beetles, varroa mites, and American foul brood. But recent research seems to show that American foul brood in Florida has started to become resistant to the antibiotic treatments that have traditionally been used to help treat hives with it, and that encouraging bees to have strong hygienic behavior in the hive is actually a better strategy for trying to combat some of the common challenges that hives face as a health issue, because we're otherwise selecting for bees that will require us to help them with treatments that actually are not very good for their hive or their development overall. So that might sound a little optimistic, but right now we've got one hive that's building. I think for our size property in Florida, we can have up to 3 colonies, and I hope to be able to have in the near future at least 2 hives, if not 3, so that if a hive faces a particular challenge from disease or pests, and other hives might do better with them, that in the long term that we can help select for the bee population here that will be capable of maintaining some of its own health and hygiene better, and not rely on human intervention that in the long run tends to weaken their own resistance to disease or develop stronger disease vectors.
Because all you're doing is making stronger viruses, which is kind of what we're doing in the human population as well. And bees in the wild don't have access to any of that. They just have to, live or die as their instincts and their behavior, as you say, hygienic behavior dictates. So, it makes sense.
Exactly. So that may be in part kind of informed by our pagan approach to beekeeping.
Yeah.
Trying to take a little bit of a holistic look at what makes a hive healthy, so we also don't use, significant amount of any kind of pesticides or herbicides at home for fruit trees or our gardening.
Right. I'm pretty sure, well, I can't speak for all pagans, but most of the people that I know are in the same mindset as you, that we should not really try to improve on Mother Nature, because really she does pretty well without us, and most of the time when we try to improve, all we do is mess it up. You have to register with the state, and then they send an inspector by to check on your hives and your practices and all that. And you're in an urban area like we are, correct?
Yes, we're in Miami Springs, so it might be considered suburban more than urban, but it is certainly not agricultural land or a place where there's a lot of open space other than small parks.
Right. So you are also environmental attorney. So
that's correct.
As an environmental attorney, have you looked into all of the what ifs? A swarm goes out and stings my neighbor, litigation and all that kind of stuff that might be associated with keeping bees in your backyard?
Well, there's a couple of basic principles that I've looked at in the law regarding keeping bees in our kind of environment. Other aspects about the risks of beekeeping are addressed by a mix of the statute and rules that were passed here in Florida and common law principles. When something is put into statute and rule, generally what's considered common law doesn't control anymore because the state has decided on rules to administer for an activity. So, for instance, if you have a hive within 5 feet of or within 15 feet of your property line, I believe it is, you need to have a fence that would help ensure that when the bees fly out of the hive, their flyway takes them up in the air so that they're not going off your property and immediately flying at kind of, chest or head level into your neighbors. So the placement of your hive and the ability for the hive to be reasonable in relation to your own neighbors' enjoyment of their land is reflected in those rules. And you're also supposed to be able to have a regular water source for them on your own property to help make sure that they don't have to forage elsewhere for water.
Like your neighbor's pool.
Sometimes they might go to a neighbor's pool.
Yeah.
We also live close to a canal, but we maintain a water source on the property too. Now, for things that might not be addressed in the rules, there's still the possibility that if someone got injured by bees that they think came from our property, that they could say that they were injured by something we're doing. So we're a little sensitive to the fact that there are some neighbor relations involved in keeping bees, and even the best intentioned people could still run into a problem.
Right.
So we're not going to face the hive directly towards where our trash pickup is or where our recycling pickup would be. We want to make sure that the bees' main path of travel away from the hive doesn't take them right into areas where other people that help service our own property are going to be active from time to time and need to do trash pickup or recycling pickup. One of the other basic things that can be done is to try and be aware that in spring seasons, hives may swarm, meaning some bees and a queen might leave the hive and go look for a new home. And for some neighbors or people, it's a very dramatic time because the bees may fly in a very tight configuration and a lot of them are out on the move, and they may worry that the bees are trying to come out and attack them. But even very calm bees, traditional American honeybees, for instance, that aren't Africanized at all, will still exhibit this behavior, mostly just because it's a natural behavior if the hive is well developed and they may need some space to grow, to swarm, and to look for a new home and a place to expand. So some beekeepers will keep available an extra hive, sometimes a small one that is a nucleus hive or a bee trap, where in the spring it's a place where a swarm may be attracted to go and to establish their new home safely there, rather than maybe go out into the broader neighborhood and find a tree branch or limb or the eaves of a house to try and nest in. So those are some of the things that we've thought through in terms of keeping bees on our own property and trying to understand that, we should be expressing care for our neighborhood, not just for its ecology, but also for the humans that live here.
Right. Those are all kind of common sense things too, but I think sometimes people don't think it through, and it sounds like you've really thought it through in a very meaningful and well thought out way. So your plans are to have more hives in the future.
Well, right now we have one hive, and for most people that pursue treatment-free beekeeping, the recommendation is to have more than one hive, because as a hive might face disease or pest challenges, or maybe multiple hives face them, the survival of the hive or the ability to tell which bees might be really well adapted to dealing with those challenges, they can differ amongst the hives that you have at the house. And over time, you can help select for maintaining bee colonies that are really well adapted to your local environment, including its diseases and pests. It's a little harder with one hive because if you have a single hive that gets overwhelmed, then basically you're starting from scratch again. So we do plan to establish at least one more hive in order to help best implement that strategy, even at the small scale that we can do here on our property.
Cool. And of course, you mentioned that you have friends who also keep bees, so maybe you could swap among your friends as well if that happened.
Well, if anything disastrous happens, as you know, you are one of our friends who keeps bees as well, as well as your partner Riekin and our local friend Qabal. And so if any of us at this point has a kind of a hive disaster that really affects whether or not we have any bees at the house, we may be able to help turn to each other to either do a swarm catcher in the spring or to do what's known as a split or a graft, where we could basically help encourage the development of a new hive from the hive or hives that we have now and help keep each of us going as local beekeepers. So luckily we have a little community network here, even outside of the traditional beekeeper associations that are also a real strong resource for people starting out, trying to understand what to expect from beekeeping, and also how to learn enough that you can employ your common sense. And so some of the common sense stuff that you mentioned earlier, I wouldn't have known unless I spent some time really listening to other people about beekeeping. Because things don't make common sense sometimes unless you have a little bit of a framework for it.
Right.
So I'm really grateful to have friends like you and Riekin and Qabal, and the availability of local beekeeper associations to be able to help expand my knowledge. There's some other resources that are widely available these days too, fortunately, with the development of the internet. But there's almost nothing like local experience and people that you can talk to that will help you become comfortable starting out beekeeping.
Yes, very much so. Because, as they say, all beekeeping is local. And in Florida, we do not have a winter. I mean, seriously, there's really no winter here. I mean, if you're up near Georgia area or the Panhandle, you might have some low temperatures, but nothing like what people go through in areas like Wisconsin or Idaho or Vermont. Those beekeepers, their bees, they really seriously have to have enough stores to get them through the winter, and they have to winter over the hives, and it's very tricky and takes a lot of judgment and finesse and all of that, and it's not uncommon for some of them to actually lose a hive because of get too cold and they freeze or they starve to death or something. But you don't have to face that here, which is really nice, but there are other challenges that we do have. So yeah, I think anybody that wants to get into beekeeping in their area should definitely seek out a local beekeeping association. And there seems to be a lot of interest in keeping bees. I think maybe, I don't know if it's the colony collapse disorder that sparked it, or, global warming, or just a basic wake-up call to people that are monitoring and care about the environment. But I do see a rise in the interest in local backyard beekeeping. So aside from joining your local beekeeping association, do you have any other tips that you would give to somebody who's looking into doing this?
Sure. I think trying to start reading up on beekeeping is always a great start. There's some vocabulary to become familiar with so that when you're reading resources, you're not a little bit lost. I would not have known before I started reading up, for instance, what somebody might mean when they talk about a 10-frame deep or a super, or, what foundationless frames were versus foundation frames. And, there's always some literacy in an endeavor that is good to become familiar with. So the other reason besides basic kind of knowledge of the vocabulary about beekeeping and some of the common strategies for it that is useful for a new beekeeper, I think, or a NewBEE, as we're often called, is you probably want to start thinking about your own strategies for beekeeping. So what are your goals? I don't have goals as a backyard beekeeper of necessarily developing a large business producing honey. It would be nice to have some honey production that I could share in, but it's not my main goal, right? So basically I have a little flexibility to help decide how I'm going to manage my hives. And I think the early learning that you can do about the different strategies people take for beekeeping and what goals you might have for why you're beekeeping will help you develop your own goals. So when you end up in conversations with people or read materials that might otherwise be helpful, but might be from a different perspective, like commercial beekeeping or bee research, or even treatment-free if you don't share that one, you have a little context to hear them in and a better chance to learn from some of the experience of other beekeepers without necessarily a lot of confusion because of lack of vocabulary or a lot of judgment. And I think that as a pagan pursuing backyard beekeeping, there's a nice segue between my practical goals and I think my more spiritual interaction with the hive in the sense of being able to respect its own development, appreciate its presence, and to see what it has to offer to the other types of plants and animals around us. So beekeeping is a really productive way to, I think, pursue a nice intersection of practical and spiritual goals, as long as I can allow the bees to also help show me what they can do and not to have goals out of the box that ask too much of them. I might be able to develop enough of a partnership to know more about what I can ask of our hives over time. But I think it's a start.
Cool. I noticed that Qabal has started a pagan beekeeping page on Facebook. So at this point, I'm going to mention that if anybody listening is aspiring to become a beekeeper, no matter where you live, you can ask to join the Pagan Beekeeping Facebook page, join in the conversation, and talk about your experiences if you have any, or just pick other people's brains if you want to. There are some people on there that already have hives. There are some people that had hives and don't any longer. And there are some people that are wannabes. and they are asking questions and researching to get hives. So at this point, I really want to thank you, Canu, for coming on and talking about your experiences. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I've spent most of my time in thinking about beekeeping as a wannabe. I'm really happy to be at the stage where I've gotten to be a newbie, and hopefully the path ahead is going to be really rewarding. I'm grateful that Qabal and you and Riekin all are available to help mentor me, and that the Pagan Beekeepers group on Facebook is even more widely available to help us mentor and receive mentoring from other pagan beekeepers that have a lot more experience. Because as much as I've talked about my impressions and goals, I feel like I'm just at the beginning of something, and I'm really very grateful for the support that's been offered.
It is exciting to be at the beginning of a new adventure.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be able to be on the podcast, Bridget, and to help talk about beekeeping. I hope we can have some more segments that include some of our other local pagan beekeepers or even pagan beekeepers from around the country.
That would be awesome. Thank you so much.
You're really welcome.
And now comes a song by Mama Gina called Nine Toes the Bard from her brand new album by the same name, Nine Toes the Bard. Come on, Mama Gina, take us out.
This is a true story, and it's a drinking song. There once was a bard with one hell of a curse. Her memory was sharp, she'd recite every verse. Her strings they tuned true, and her drum did the same. But no one remembered her name. Oh, no one remembered her name. She'd hold their attention all night in a bar. Her voice held them captive, her tales took them far. But they ne'er call her back, oh, and that was a shame, 'cause no one remembered her name. Oh, no one remembered her name. They'd all sing, there goes the bard, there goes the bard. Her stories were clever, her fingers were deft. We drank all the ale until there was none left. She was lovely and managed our every request. We'd love to have her back. It's a shame we can't remember her name. Oh, we can't remember her name. That bard made a living, she could have done worse, but she could have done better if not for that curse. The ticket to increase her fortune and fame, my folks must remember her name. Oh, they must remember her name. She traveled due north and she traveled down south. She searched for some magic to rub that spell out. But ere she traveled, the story's the same. No one remembered her name. No one remembered her name. Oi, they'd all sing, there goes the bard, there goes the bard. If The local boys tossed her about in their beds. They'd remember their toes curled, how they lost their heads. Her cello-shaped hips, oh, their fantasies fed. They remembered her bosom and her red curly mane, but they couldn't remember her name. No, they couldn't remember her name. Now, every good bardic tale needs a couple of things to make it a great bardic tale. It needs a key change, and it needs a dragon. 'Twas a dragon was said that might ruin her curse. If that lecherous lizard didn't ruin her first. The bard sought him out and said, baby, I'm game, if folks will remember my name. Oh, if they'll remember my name. I'll fix your dilemma, the dragon spoke true. You'll sleep with me this night and I'll take my due. The bard stilled herself and stepped into that flame, all for the want of a memorable name. And the dragon said, come here, me bard. Come here, me bard. I'll not singe your eyelashes, nor nip at your nose. My particular fetish, look at those toes. I think that I'd like a percentage of those. Oh yes, they'll remember your name. Oh yes, they'll remember your name. And that dragon, he leered with those lizardly eyes, said, don't worry, I've flame to cauterize. He lunged for her feet without any foreplay, and the bard fainted dead away. Oh, the bard fainted dead away. Now, I've worked very hard for a PG-13 rating on this song, so I'll not be going into any detail as to what actually happened between the bard and that dragon, you know. She woke in the morning, the dragon was gone. Feeling a kilter, something was wrong. Now she didn't feel used and she didn't feel cheap, but something was missing. She lifted the sheets. It's a good thing I don't play guitar with my feet, but I think they'll remember my name. Oh, yes, they'll remember my name. And now everywhere she goes, everybody sings 9 toes the bard, 9 toes the bard. Her story's loud, witty, her fingers are swift, her rhythm is spot on. She's got quite the gift. She plays with the boots off and walks with a limp. She's 9 toes the bard. Aye, she's 9 toes the bard. Oh yeah, 9 toes the bard. 9 toes the bard. Now there's a dragon who treasures that one toe on ice, and a bard who's willing to sacrifice a piece of his soul, S-O-L-E, see what I did there? It's a pun, for the sake of her arts. And we all remember her name. Oh,